Let me tell you the sad tale of Doris Lehman. She was Mrs. Mike Coppola, Trigger Mike Coppola. Right there, there's your problem. You really shouldn't marry anybody who goes by the name Trigger. Actually, you shouldn't be friends with somebody who goes by the nickname Trigger. That's a problem waiting to happen. Anyway, in 1940, Mike Coppola, Trigger Mike Coppola, he had an enormous empire, criminal empire in New York, most of it in Harlem. He was a narcotics runner, early narcotics runner, uh, pushing dope in Harlem. He had numbers business over there. He had a lot of political sway, and that's the crux of the problem. In 1946, Coppola learned that a guy named Joseph Scottoriggio, I hope I got that right, Scottoriggio, it's close. I don't think we're going to have a test on this later, but that's about what it was. So he's the Republican captain in Harlem, Italian Harlem probably, which was much bigger than it is today at one point. So he intended Scottoriggio to back another candidate that Mike didn't want in office. So on election day, Coppola and one of his men, Joey Rao, drive over to Harlem. Joey Rao, if you've ever heard of Rao's sauces, Rao's very famous restaurant in Italian Harlem, you have to wait 3 years to get a seat. Frank Pellegrino, if you watch The Sopranos, Frank Pellegrino, who was part of the Rao family, part of the owner of Rao's in Italian Harlem, he played the FBI district boss in The Sopranos. He died recently, I think. Anyway, Rao used to work for Dutch Schultz. In 1931, he was walking down the street in Harlem, and Mad Dog Cole saw him, was waiting for him, actually, and drove by with a machine gun firing out the window on East 107th Street. And the only thing he accomplished, Rao ran for it. I think Rao jumped behind some children. That's what some of the newspapers said. Rao ran for it. The machine gun let loose, and it killed a 5-year-old boy. Awful. And it shot several other children, too. So, anyway, so for some reason known only to God, Coppola decides to take along his wife, Doris, and his father-in-law, David Lehman, who's a retired salesman, to the beatdown for this Republican captains. They go to Scottoriggio's home. Scottoriggio is there with two guys. They're about to go out and work the polls. Coppola and Rao jump out of the car. They beat him so bad that he died 6 days later. Scottoriggio, they beat him mercilessly. And the two guys with him ran away, which is pretty awful. He died. New York was outraged. And this is really something to kill a poll worker. His wife and her father-in-law were sent off to Rhode Island to hide with a guy named Butsey Morelli, who ran the mob up in Rhode Island for a long time. There was a massive manhunt. D.A. Hogan eventually got them to surrender and brought him back to New York. D.A. Hogan, by the way, grew up in a house in Waterbury, Connecticut that is owned by my Aunt Maureen now. They both stood trial, went in for a hearing, rather. Doris and her father-in-law said nothing. And so Hogan slapped him with perjury charges. What happened next? I think what happened was Doris was very pregnant. Mike was a wife beater. He was a punk generally. And I think Doris had had enough and might have been threatening to turn tail and tell stories about him in court. Who knows? But on March the 17th in 1948, she went into Saint Vincent's Hospital and she gave birth to a daughter. Doris was 26 years old at the time, very young. And the next day, after the baby's born, she died from, quote, complications from childbirth, the hospital said. There's no autopsy. Her body was cremated immediately on Coppola's orders. Coppola sent some guys down there to make sure the body was cremated. So she died. And when she died, all the charges against Coppola, the entire case against Coppola that the state had, and it was a good case in Rio, just fell apart. It was gone. So I think he killed her, really. The charges against the father, her father, for perjury were dropped because he was 70, almost 80 years old at the time. So anyway, there's no loose threads. That's that. It's all over. I read in the papers 5,000 people attended her funeral. You know, when you read these things, bear in mind the vast majority of those people are rubberneckers. Just want to see a mob guy's wife dead. And anyway, years later, Coppola marries another woman named Ann Coppola, and she's tough. She's not Doris. She's a match for him. It was not a good marriage. They moved down to Florida. She filed for divorce in 1960 for, among other things, claiming that, and I believe her, that Coppola was supplying her daughter, who was older, in her 20s, with drugs. And, you know, who else knows what was going on there. So she agrees to testify against Coppola in a tax investigation case. And they're separated at this point. So Coppola sends two guys over. They kidnap her from her house. They beat her senseless as a warning on a beach, rather. I should say they took her down to an isolated beach and beat her senseless near her home. She didn't faze her. She continued to be a witness in the case. Good for her. And then in April of 1961, Coppola was indicted, 4 counts of tax evasion. There was a mistrial. There was another trial. He pleaded guilty. He was fined $40,000 in 1960. So not a small amount of money. And he got 4 years in the can. It's about time. Ann Coppola not only fled to Italy, she took $250,000 of his money with her. And when she was there, $250,000 in 1962. It's a lot of cash. And it was cash, by the way. So while she's in Italy, she's in Rome, she wrote a long letter to the IRS and Bobby Kennedy detailing, this is 1962, detailing everything Coppola was into, who his buddies were, what they were into, what they were all doing. I mean, she had it all. And she mailed it off, and she mailed one to the IRS, one to Bobby Kennedy. And then, unfortunately, she killed herself with an overdose of sleeping pills.